vary from study to study. Overall, it appears that about 80% of kids with gender dysphoria end up feeling okay with their bodies they were born into. Okay, so that pulls us back now to Genesis 1:27. Let's just put it up again and make sure we're on the same page. Let's read it again. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So just a few observations. One is that we are creatures, right? We're not the creator, we are creatures. And as creatures, we were made by our creator, male and female. That God created both our bodies and our minds, and he called those very good, which meant that they worked well together. They were well-functioning and well-ordered. That God created two genders. They're equal in value, dignity, and worth. Two genders that are not interchangeable. Two genders that are not arbitrary. Two genders that together resemble God. Think of all the ways that God could have defined us. He could have defined us by our Enneagram number. He could have defined us as left brain, right brain. He could have defined us by our Myers-Briggs test results. He could have defined us by race. He didn't. Instead, it says he created them male and female. So I don't think it's too big of a jump to say that gender is not superficial to who we are. That it's not malleable. That what people often derisively call the gender binary, it's not rooted in the patriarchy. It's not rooted in Victorian era ethics. No, it's rooted in God. Which means that gender is not a social construct. Men and women, two genders, are foundational to God's plan. And blurring those gender lines doesn't please God. Men and women, two genders, both created in the image of God with value, dignity, respect, but are different. Men and women are different. Look at this Time magazine cover. We showed the other one earlier of Laverne Cox and the transgender tipping point. Why men and women are different. If you can't read the bottom, the subtitle is, it isn't just upbringing. New studies show they are born that way. Huh. So that's old school right there. You're different. We know that. I mean, there's that book, I never read it, but that book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. You know, I don't know if it's good or not, but it's just obvious to people that men and women are different. But how are they different? Well, some things are a bit more obvious than others. It gets hard sometimes when you try to say, is there a biblical picture of masculinity and a biblical picture of femininity? I think you'd be hard-pressed to nail that down with any specificity. Each culture has a way that men and women express themselves. But the problem is that sometimes in our culture especially, and by the way, I think the church has reinforced this and not been helpful, we come up with a very narrow definition of what it looks like to be a man or a woman. You know, in the most extreme stereotypical ways of thinking, men like sports, violence, hunting, and are borderline Neanderthals. And women, they like tea parties and flowery dresses. And then what happens when you get these narrow definitions of what it means to be a man or a woman? By the way, I think those are cultural. I just want to be really clear, not biblical at all. But when you get these narrow definitions, if you're a man or a woman who likes something different, then somehow, in the cultural stereotype, then somehow you're confused about, well, am I really a man, really a woman? Am I really a woman if I like, my hair's short and I like football? Am I really a man if I like art and I'm emotional? Yes. Yes. There's a lot of different ways to be a man or a woman. There's not like this one way that everybody's got to fit into. My favorite toy as a kid was with this whole set of dolls I had. That's all you have pictures of me when I was a kid. I just drug dolls around and played with them all the time. But nobody freaked out about it. Now, some of you are saying, well, I mean, that's Genesis, and I'm glad we're going through it. I'm glad it's in the Bible. But man, that's an old book, right? Are we even sure we're interpreting that right? I mean, I'm more of a Jesus Christian than a Genesis Christian. Well, fantastic. So if you call Jesus Lord, if you follow Jesus, you're going to have to deal with this issue. Because Jesus talks about it. In a contentious debate with the Pharisees about divorce, listen to what Jesus says in Matthew 19. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning, the Creator, now look at this, he's quoting Genesis 1:27, made them male and female. And for this reason, now he's in quoting Genesis 2, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Jesus thought Genesis was scripture. Jesus thought Genesis was binding on people in every age and every culture. And when he was debating a controversial topic, Jesus went back to Genesis and said, this is God's design. We believe that Jesus wants what's best for people, don't we? Jesus thought living by biblical sexual ethics was what was best for human welfare. Jesus thought that living by biblical sexual ethics was best for human flourishing. Jesus thought it was best when we live according to God's design. Now maybe some of you are saying, well, but, there's a lot of research happened since Jesus was around. And, bless his heart, he didn't have as much information as we do. Well, maybe. So people say, look, there are people today who are born intersex, with ambiguous genitalia. What about them? Jesus didn't know about that. Doesn't that show that gender is not? Well, be careful, because Jesus did know. We're going to read a couple of verses in a second, but let me explain what a word means first. Eunuch, if not a word we use a lot. A eunuch was someone who has been castrated, a man, almost always a man, who's been castrated, so that he could work in a harem, a king's harem. So the main place a eunuch was, you had a man that you wanted to attend to the king's harem, you castrated him before he took that role. But then that word could be used as metaphorical, in a metaphorical sense, to refer to other things. So watch what Jesus is saying. This is in the same context. He's just said male, female. Now he says this down in verse 11. Jesus replied, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who are born that way. That's what we're interested in, but let me go ahead and keep reading. And there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. That's those who have been castrated at the hands of others. And those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. These are people who have chosen a life of celibacy because of a call they think God has on their life. But what we're interested in is that Jesus knows there are people who are born with biological problems with their sexual organs. He knows that. He knows, he didn't call it intersex, that's a modern term, but he knows that condition. And Jesus is very comfortable acknowledging that people are born with sexual ambiguity, and yet affirming male and female. Affirming God's design. So what do we do with cases like that, like people born intersex today? Well, we have a lot of compassion. We come alongside. We say we know we live in a broken world. Our bodies are often broken. It's a sin-cursed world. And we encourage and support. How should Christians respond to the small number but very real people who experience gender dysphoria? Well, it kind of depends a little bit who it is, kind of. I mean, let's start with this. If that's your child or your grandchild who tells you that, I think you give them a big hug and you tell them you love them and thank you so much for sharing something that was so personal to them, and that you'll figure this out together. That nothing will ever change that you love your child, your grandchild. Nothing could possibly change that. I think that's what you need to tell them. If they share this with you, that they're struggling with this, And maybe that should be our approach to everybody, not just our kid. Maybe our approach should be compassion, that our heart should go out to people, that we should listen, that we don't always have something to say. Sometimes we just close our mouth and listen and empathize with people. Maybe that should always be our first response. Can you imagine what it would be like to grow up as a kid or be an adult and have this confusion between your internal identity and your body? I've read some of that stuff. I've listened to people explain it, and I don't have words for it. It breaks your heart for them. So how about compassion? But if a person wants to keep talking about it after the compassion's been shown, they want to keep talking about it, and they're not a Christian, I'd rather talk about Jesus. Now, it's not that I'm unwilling to talk about gender identity with somebody who's not a Christian. I'm happy to have a conversation. It's just that gender's not my cause. Jesus is. I'd much rather spend my time talking with you about Jesus than gender. Jesus doesn't say, get this figured out and then come to me. He says, come to me, all you are broken, all you are weary. Come to me as you are. So that's our cause, Jesus, not gender. But I'm happy to talk about it if they want to. But let's say you're a Jesus follower. Let's say that you call Jesus Lord. Let's say you call Jesus Lord and you are experiencing gender dysphoria. Or someone you care about is experiencing gender dysphoria. Or this is being talked about in our culture and you just want to know, well, what do I do? How do I think about this? Well, doesn't it come back to authority? Who has authority in our life? We've already seen what the Bible says. We've seen what Jesus says, and we could put more verses up, but we get the point. It just comes back to who has authority in my life. Is it Jesus or the culture? Am I going to? Remember a couple weeks ago and I stood on that Bible? I felt like a fool. But I stood on that Bible and I said, are we going to stand on the Bible and impose our views on the Bible? Or are we going to submit to the Bible? Put it over our heads, surrender and submit and say, whether I get it or not, whether I even like it or not, I'm going to submit and surrender to what God says. It all comes down to authority. We're tempted to let culture become the authority in our life, but be careful if you do. Paraphrase a little story Tim Keller tells. Imagine a Viking living centuries ago. And he has two identities, two impulses in his heart, two things he feels deeply. One is violence, and the other is he feels like he's a woman trapped in a man's body. He loves war. He loves aggression. He loves to break things and kill people. And in that culture, that would have been affirmed. And he would have said, do it. And he would have said, this is who I am. I am a violent warrior. And this gender identity crisis, that's not really me. He would suppress it. That's not me. I don't know where. I don't want that. Now let's take that person, same issues, and put him in modern day Colombia or New York or wherever you want to put him. Same impulses. An impulse toward violence and aggression and an impulse towards a gender identity crisis. Well, you know what we tell them today? We say, get therapy for that aggression, right? You need to get therapy for that. That's not good. We can fix that, though. This gender identity thing, yeah, that's for sure you. Do that. Pursue your authentic self. So do you see what happened? Is the only thing that changed was the culture. What era were you living in? What did the culture affirm? If you're going to go down the road of just going with the culture and whatever the culture says and that's your authority, you're not going to be able to follow Jesus. It's just not going to work. You can't call culture Lord and Jesus Lord. Be careful if you follow culture.